Welcome to this wonderful webinar. I'll ask Dr. Asefa to open. Dr. Asefa and the rest of the panelists, you can enable your videos now so you can others can see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samson. Good morning, everyone, or good or good afternoon, depending where you are. We are excited to have this great presentation today, and in fact, more of an exchange and question and answer. This is by popular demand. Last time we presented a similar webinar, and the feedback we got was that we should give more time for discussion and question and answer. So we encourage you to continue to send your questions to Mr. Samson as we go through the presentation. First, I would like to invite Mr. Samson Teffera, who is the president and co-founder of weASPiRE. He will provide a quick overview of weASPiRE. Mr. Samson comes with information technology background, works as a division director for U.S. Department of Labor. He's a dedicated civil servant, community leader, poet, storyteller, and he's a registered volunteer expert with the International Executive Service Corps. American Circle members, Books for Africa, lifetime honorary member for the Ethiopian Red Cross, as well as Ethiopian desk representing for Computer World Exchange. He has also been a part with other many volunteer groups, among others. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Mr. Samson Teffera.
Thank you, Dr. Tirusew. I'm going to go back and forth with first name, last name, but I'm going to start referring with your first name, if you don't mind, dear panelists. Thank you, Dr. Tirusew. weASPiRE is very excited to host this webinar. This is a second of its kind. We will be releasing these videos after the webinar. So weASPiRE is a think tank, an African-focused think tank. The mission is to enhance the world knowledge about Africa and its people. And it's run by a group of educated and highly motivated volunteers who understand the value of intellectual approach to information sharing. The group believes that by modeling together knowledge, passion, humility, and kindness, various verticals and disciplines can be discussed. The GERD and the Nile happen to be one of the verticals that we picked up after our organization started. We have other parallel efforts going, the African trade. We also work on youth development and other topics coming on board. And in order to present and share the best work to address these topics that are crucial to Africa advancement. We want poverty to be a thing of the past. You hardly hear anything good about Africa in the in the media. So we want that to change. We want to empower by presenting context. We want to step in where there is a void. We want to reach out where there is a need. We are Africans standing for Africa. We want Africans to learn from one another. So this is a collaborative effort. COVID gives us, the upside is the virtual communication that started after the start of the COVID pandemic. So it brings the world together, really. We have members in Ethiopia and other parts of Africa, in Europe and Asia. So this is a wonderful platform. Welcome, and I'm very happy to be able to open this webinar and be part of it. So first, I would like to introduce our own member, Dr. Tirusew Asefa. He is he's a weASPiRE member. He's one of our experts in this area. We have several experts within weASPiRE, so we're really fortunate to have him working with us. Dr. Asefa is a System Division Support Group Lead at Tampa Bay Water. It is the largest wholesale water provider in Southeast United States. His group is responsible for technical analysis and modeling of projects ranging between $200 million to $400 million. Dr. Asefa is affiliated with the University of South Florida. here in the US and provides short courses and training at the Pan-African University in energy water, Tilimcan, Algeria. Tirusew has written more than 35 peer-reviewed articles in various areas of water resource management. I don't know if this include the dozen articles he wrote for weASPiRE regarding the GERD and the Nile. He's a registered professional engineer with the state of Florida, diplomat of the American Academy of Water Resource Engineers, and a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He currently chairs Florida Water and Climate Alliance. With that, please welcome Dr. Tirusew as our first speaker. And I will introduce the next speaker after he's done. For Q&A, send us your questions in the chat. We'll save some time at the end to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Tirusew.
Thank you. Welcome everyone again. So the idea here is to go through a big picture, and then you will be listening a little bit more targeted topics following my presentation with the other panelists as well. We took the title "Taking GERD negotiation to the next level" because of things that going on right now, and that's why we decided to use the current name as it is. So the question comes with many people's mind is why the current negotiation is stalled. As you know, the African Union led a negotiation started late October, and there is still significant disagreement on what exactly should be covered by the current round of negotiation. Among those is the idea of binding versus non-binding agreement, what exactly that means. How do you account for water allocation, which if it is a binding, basically some release scenarios, that's still a big question there. And then also through those quantities implied release, there is the 1955 colonial agreement regarding the share, how the water of Nile was shared. As it stands currently, of course, 100% between Sudan and Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt, with 0% for Ethiopia. So how do you reconcile this in terms of if we say it's a binding agreement? I think that's where it is also. And then the other is drought time release. So how do you cooperate and what do you do during drought time? Drought is going to come just like flood. In fact, in the future, we expect more of this swing between drought and flood. So you do need a way to cooperate and a way to address those natural cycles. And then recently, we also heard through the media, how do we look at the role of external expert. We understand that the African Union is also trying to help the negotiation as well as potentially providing expert views or expert opinions. So how do that expert opinion looks like? So big picture, this is where we are today. One thing we wrote recently, myself and Dr. Mogus, was that we argued, in fact, what you need to do is some kind of a progressive Nile-based negotiation. This is not a new topic. This is not a new idea. Adaptive management has been used for decades in water resource planning. So one of the things we argue there is all countries in the Nile Basin should work toward a binding agreement that's based on some form of equitable share. Again, you may have heard the equitable share many times, but how you exactly you define it, that's the question. Current allocation, like I said, doesn't have any allocation for Ethiopia. So we argue that the way to go forward, in fact, is to use a step-based decision process that basically follows an adaptive water resource management. This is not a trial and error. This is rather you make a stepwise decision and then collect data, get stakeholder agreement, and then do the next one. Again, you have these three distinct points related to that. You have the filling, which they are discussing. Then you have the operations of GERD once it's being filled, and then there is a water allocation. So I think if you take this as a stepwise process and get first the filling part done and then do the operation as well as the water allocation is what we are arguing on under this article, which you may want to refer that. Again, this is also widely supported by international experts, including EU. So we think that's one way to go forward. You might have heard this, unfortunately, this summer we got a lot of floods because of what was happening, in the Nile basins, and those are not just only in the Blue Nile, which is primarily coming from Ethiopia, but also in the White Nile. For example, last May, we saw a record level of Lake Victoria, and then later on, we saw in other areas. This is on top of the triple threat the region received, including COVID, and then you might also heard about locust. In fact, locust also is related with climate. This year we had quite a bit of La Nina impact, so you can go back and actually relate this kind of weather with locust. So the weather and climate is not just impacting us from water supply perspective, but also on our farming as well. So I think that's interesting. The flooding problem is not just only in Sudan or even in Egypt. This was early February, around there. So you will find almost everywhere this flooding issue. Again, that shows that I think the countries have a good opportunity to be able to address these significant issues. In fact, we looked at the flooding issue and we did some scenarios. This is just at the beginning of October. We did this in September. And what we did was that we looked at similar floods from 1988 and we did some scenarios. So at that time, what we found was that if GERD was in operation today, it would have accommodated up to 125 to 150% more of the 1988 flood. So when we were doing this number, we didn't have the data regarding the current flood. Well, fast forward months later, we were able to get the data and to actually see whether this kind of damage could be averted. As you heard, more than 100 people died and hundreds of millions of property damage. So what you see in this picture is the broken line here is a stage, basically stage levels, the flood level in Sudan. This is the gauge station just inside Sudan. You see in brown is the 2988 flood, and then the blue is the current flood. So you can see that it was significant amount that went above that flood level. In fact, what happened was that you can see that this is the time when Ethiopia actually started filling the dam, and in a sense it delays this flood. You can see that otherwise this could have shot up before that. So when we look at this flood, what we found was that the 2020 flood we saw in Sudan was the highest in 100 years in terms of the record for Nile. But it needed only 10 to 15 billion cubic meter space in GERD. And again, I would like to remind folks that the typical operation of GERD is between 49 billion cubic meter and full 74. So typically they will start low at the beginning of the summer, and then they will fill it after the summer, and then they generate power and they send the water downstream. So in a typical operation, it has actually a space of 25 billion cubic meters. So as you can see, even this flood that comes once in 100 years can be accommodated pretty easily based on the numbers that we see. That's where the flood is needed to be handled. And again, recently after this, you may have seen different articles coming in from, this is a recent one from BBC, and this is actually from Sudan's perspective, how the flood really impacted them. And then also how, at the end, if GERD is in place, how that would have helped them. I will let you to read what Dr. Salman in this case said. But I think it's important we should look at this cooperation, the dam, both from flood and drought perspective. Again, this is, we believe that something for the region, something for the entire Nile Basin, something for Africa, as Mr. Samson said at the beginning, I think. So it shows to me that, you know, there is a way from technical perspective. It's just a matter of willingness of cooperation between the three countries. Now, I get question always, now what? Some of the big issues that we are seeing recently is that how this may impact downstream Egypt. And this is a plot of the Lake Nasser, and this is a combination using a satellite information from USDA. You can see right now it has been the highest basically in record. You have to go all the way back to 2020 years ago to find something similar. In fact, again, we did some simple calculation in terms of evaporation loss. You can see these are staggering numbers that actually currently being lost, even that. But if you cooperate and hold somewhere else right now, you can see that at GERD, the calculation is about you are losing where it is 0.3 BCM. Whereas last year was 16 billion cubic meters evaporation. So even from this, I think the point we are trying to make is that there is a way, if people really wants to cooperate and then have the political will, the numbers doesn't support this kind of animosity, this kind of disagreement. There is enough water for everyone, and then you know, a matter of handling all those in a cooperative way will be the best to go forward. And then, of course, I'm not sure you will be able to see that. In fact, one of the Egyptian experts wrote me back, and he said, yeah, of course, they know that. What we know that the way to store water as a basin scale is actually to put it in a place that you don't have much of loss, as well as, you know, use up the balance. You increase the storage in the system. I think this should not be overlooked. So the moment you put more dam, then you are putting both storage for supply as well as for flooding. That's my last slide. There is also a question that always comes in terms of climate change and drought sharing. Some of my panelists will address as well. I will just say this, from pure technical perspective, the Nile Basin is actually lucky to have a weak correlation between equatorial Nile and Eastern Nile, and in terms of climate, in terms of weather. So there is a 1 to 2 years of flexibility within the basin that you can leverage. Like I said, the highest water levels was in May in Lake Victoria, and then it's in August in Sudan. So you have 4 months actually to use the science and be able to manage. So in that sense, there is a big opportunity in terms of that. So climate change, what would it impact in the future? We can discuss later on again. We have seen some of the numbers. What we see is typically the rainfall may not change, but the temperature may be significantly increasing. That brings, you know, where you should store it, and then how that may change the sequence of flows into the future. That's a big issue as well. And then the big question is, how do you share drought? How do you share dry time resource allocation? As you collaborate during flood time, you want also to collaborate during drought time. You will hear later on regarding, you know, what's being done in Colorado River Basin. We have also implemented similar measures here in Tampa Bay area. Of course, it's very small pilot scale, but what you want to do is both demand side and supply side water management, as well as using advances in prediction. So again, this summarizes a big picture. I think I'm hopeful that there is a lot of way to go forward if there is a willingness again. That's all. Please send your question in. And then we'll come back to that later on. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Samson.
Thank you, Dr. Tirusew. We are receiving a lot of great questions. And while I'm introducing the next speaker, Dr. Mohammed, you can share your screen if you have anything to present. Thank you for rushing through your presentation. A lot of good questions. So I will introduce Dr. Mohammed. This is his second webinar with us. So we're glad to have him again. Dr. Mohammed is a senior policy analyst with the Central Arizona Project called CAP. and faculty associate with Arizona State University. His areas of expertise include water policy analysis, scenario planning, climate adaptation, surface water hydrology, and hydrologic modeling. He's involved in Colorado River water policy issues and tracking Colorado River Basin water supply uses and hydraulic climate conditions. He leads CAP's efforts in climate change adoption. Dr. Mohammed currently chairs the Water Utility Climate Alliance, a coalition of 12 of the largest utilities in the US providing water for 1 in 6 people in the country. With that, please welcome Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you, Samson. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
And are you able to see the slides perfectly, hopefully?
Yes.
All right, good, because I have a double screen, so what you're seeing, I'm not seeing, but hopefully you guys are seeing the right set. So as Dr. Asefa alluded and talked about, what I wanted to really share with you today is just some potential examples in the realm of transboundary water management and negotiation. And those of you that may have attended the last webinar, I talked about the similar topic, but maybe I dived in more on the technical aspect. But what I wanted to focus on today is some high-level concepts in terms of what are the things that, you know, the situation that we're seeing with the GERD and the Nile that we really need to think more about in order to move towards you know, a more successful implementation of the GERD, successful negotiation, equitable water allocation. So all these big things I think need to be addressed. And so I'm going to use some examples of the long history, probably maybe not, arguably not as long as the Nile, but in some aspects long history that the Colorado River Basin has experienced in these areas. So the first thing to really just set the stage is just to give you a little bit of background about the Colorado River Basin. There are 10 major reservoirs. There are really 2 key ones that we tend to focus on because they have the largest capacity. And a lot of the operations and allocations in the basin are dependent on them, and that's Lake Powell and Lake Mead. I'll talk about them in more detail a little bit later in the context of the theme that I presented. 40 million people rely on this basin, both in the United States and Mexico, and has a very significant power generation capacity. You'll notice in this diagram, it's a little bit busy on the map, but really the point of it is to illustrate that within and without the basin, there's a lot of diversion structures, both moving water within the basin and moving water outside of the basin. Probably the largest diversions out of the basin boundary itself that you see is towards Southern California. It serves, the water from the Colorado serves the largest irrigation district in the United States in Southern California, and that's called Imperial Irrigation District. And then also provides water to the greater Los Angeles area, and that's provided and serviced through the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Some of my colleagues there like to joke that if there's ever a water meeting anywhere in the United States, one of the 18 people in the room will be serviced by that district. I never fact checked that, but I thought it's an interesting statistic just to show you sort of the volume of water and people served both by that district in Southern California as well as that irrigation district in terms of the produce they provide. Much like the Nile, certainly in the Blue River Nile portion, this is a snow-driven system. We rely on snowmelt in the winter that aggregates through snowpack, and then we experience the spring to summer melt, and that runoff is what ends up in those reservoirs, and primarily those two key reservoirs I talked about. There are 7 basin states, so within the United States, there's 7 states that rely on this, obviously including Mexico outside the US. And the basin itself is split between an upper and lower basin. The upper basin is where almost virtually all of the water is generated, about 92%. And so that includes the states of Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. The lower basin, you could argue, is where most of the use occurs. larger population, California, Arizona, and Nevada. So how is the river managed? And this is where I want to draw on some of the potential parallels and lessons to learn. It's a long history. It really started in 1922 formally when a compact was initiated between the basin states to begin to frame how the water that's being generated from this watershed will be shared. And since then, there's been a series of treaties, a series of agreements, addendums to treaties, negotiations, etc., over essentially almost 100 years of history that we collectively, those of us that work in that basin, collectively refer to as the law of the river. And it's just a collection of all these legal agreements and negotiations. One of the things, well, the law of the river encompasses a lot of considerations. It encompasses how water is allocated, delivered between the US and Mexico. So that covers international relations. It also covers state-to-state relations, and that's through the different water allocations, water deliveries between the states. It also gives direction and guidance on how the reservoirs will be managed to help meet these deliveries and allocations between the states and between the US and Mexico. There's environmental regulations, there's water quality inclusions, and then attached to the reservoir operations, power production and distribution. So we'll touch on some of those that I think are relevant to the Nile and the GERD. So the first thing I wanted to address is this issue of interstate supply allocation. And I think we see that issue in the Nile, and Dr. Asefa brought that up, in terms of the original agreements in the Nile were really almost exclusively done between Egypt and Sudan as a consequence of the influence of colonial powers that were still in play at that point in time. As I mentioned, in the basin, the Colorado River Basin, this really started with the formal agreement of the 1922 Colorado River Compact, which identified the 7 basin states as parties, both in the upper and lower, and it apportioned what was thought then to be average flow, annual flow was 15 million acre feet, equally between the upper basin and the lower basin. So the upper basin would have 7.5, the lower basin would have 7.5. And since water is being generated in the upper basin, there was also a stipulation that if you take over a 10-year average, the upper basin should continue to guarantee that 7.5 million acre feet will be received in the lower basin. But however, right from the start, there were issues, and you start to see some of the parallels here. Arizona was the one state that refused to ratify the compact. There are a number of reasons why, but the one I think that I'll focus on, which is relevant, is there were disagreements on what tributaries should contribute to this annual flow. As I mentioned, almost all of the flow is generated in the upper basin. There are some smaller tributaries in the lower basin that probably contribute on a range of 1 to 5% of flow, which is very small compared to the amount that's being generated in the upper basin. Arizona argued that the lower basin, those minute lower basin tributaries, most of them which are within Arizona, shouldn't be part of that full allocation. And so essentially they walked out of the agreement. So this condition persisted for a long time, where the other states moved forward with the compact, and there's been a couple, I'm skipping through a lot of history here, but essentially from that point forward, there were a number of agreements that identified how much water goes to each particular state, and more of those details. But for almost 20 years, Arizona was not party to the agreement and was not essentially utilizing the water that it was originally allocated through this compact and a couple of other agreements since then. This changed because in the 40s, Arizona recognized that its population was growing, and most of the use would eventually occur in the central portion of the state. The Colorado River, if you saw it in the previous slide, acts as the border between California and Arizona. And so most of the Arizona use at that time that could take water from the river was allocated along the river itself. That does not constitute maybe not even or close to half of what Arizona's allocation was from these agreements that have occurred since. Once folks in Arizona realized, well, maybe if we build a canal to divert water from the river and then move it to central Arizona, which later on became the Central Arizona Project Canal, maybe there's a reason for them to come back to the table. And so through a series of lawsuits and legal battles between 1944 and 1964, Arizona decided to ratify the Colorado River Compact of 22 to pursue that infrastructure legislation so that they're then able to utilize all of their allocation that was given in subsequent agreements between 1922 and 1944. So Arizona receives 2.8 million acre feet. However, because Arizona wasn't using its full allocation, California was using more than the allocation was given in subsequent agreements, which was originally 4.4 million acre feet. So now they're obviously opposed to this new legislation, which would force them to curb down to their original allocation. Anyhow, Arizona filed suit against California to establish its water rights that were originally designated in a compact. This battle went back and forth until it landed with the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that Arizona's share of the Colorado River is consistent with what was determined in the 1922 Colorado River Compact and subsequent agreements, and that California had to curb down to its original apportionment. So litigation is one way to move forward, but can be very lengthy and painful. The other aspect I wanted to talk about is international transboundary flows. So if you look at the basin state to state, depending on how you look at the geography, it doesn't necessarily flow linearly from state to state, but our states are connected through tributaries. However, this issue of water going from the US to Mexico is also relevant when we look at the Nile, which essentially water is flowing from countries, sovereign countries to sovereign countries. So the US and Mexico determined in 1944 that Mexico's apportionment of the Colorado River would be 1.5 million acre feet. So they agreed on the quantity, and then they also agreed on aspects of delivery. So monthly maximum minimum water deliveries to Mexico, water ordering procedures. But there's an issue that arose from that point forward is the issue of water quality, in that water that was going to Mexico had a very high salt content, high salinity. And the reason for that is in the lower end of the system, before water flows to Mexico in the United States, primarily in Arizona, in the Yuma area, there's a lot of agricultural districts. And so as you apply water to these farms, the crops absorb the water, it's being bleached, and then the water that returns back to the river through runoff has high salt content. So that led to a Minute in 242, which was an amendment to that original treaty in 1973, to find a permanent and definitive solution to this salinity issue. And that was the linchpin to build a desalting plant in that agricultural area in the southern part of Arizona called Yuma, called the Yuma Desalting Plant. And also that Minute identified salinity constraints for the water that's being received to Mexico. So the original solution was to build the Yuma Desalting Plant. However, since that point in time, it was never fully operated. And as time wore on, it became evident that it was more expensive to operate this desalting plant. And to operate it after many years of it being inactive required a lot of extensive repairs and improvement. During that time, a sort of imperfect solution arose, which was for the US to take water from one of the largest irrigation districts in that area, Welton Mohawk Irrigation District, and to send it to Mexico in a bypass canal. And that water that's being sent through that bypass canal would not count as part of Mexico's allocation of the river. So that technically reduced the salinity of the water that Mexico receives in the river itself. But because it doesn't count through Mexico's apportionment, more water had to be released upstream. So that put a stress on the water supply. So it seemed like a decent solution, except it created a new environmental issue. And this is what we refer to impacts to the Ciénaga de Santa Clara in Mexico. So if you see in this diagram, there is there's a northern and southern boundary between the U.S. and Mexico. So as water is being released at the boundary through the Colorado River, that's how the main water quantity is received by Mexico. And then there's the bypass canal. Because of many years of water being released through the bypass canal, it essentially helped create this wetland over here called the Ciénaga de Santa Clara that then created an environmental habitat for fishes and birds. And so now when people consider, okay, well, if we restart the desalting plant to conserve water and be more conscious of the impacts of climate change, it's not so easy to turn off the water that's being received by the wetland because we inadvertently created an environmental value. And so now this complicates the issue under water stress, under climate change, under drought. What do we do to make sure that to conserve water, we don't also negatively impact this wetland? The third piece I'll talk about is related to the reservoirs. And so this is the basin system. You have water reservoir at the end of the upper basin called Glen Canyon Dam, the Lake Powell Reservoir. And then you may be familiar with Hoover Dam or Lake Mead, which is outside of Las Vegas. And I look at this as potentially a way which the GERD can operate, maybe in conjunction with the Aswan High Dam. Much like in the case of the GERD, it's essentially at the tail end of Ethiopia before water is moving into Egypt. And much like in the case of the upper basin, this reservoir helps to prevent curtailment against their supplies. And then Lake Mead is for water released downstream. In this case, comparatively, you could say water being released to Egypt for their benefit. And there's a way to make these reservoirs work together, like in the Colorado River Basin, to the benefit of all parties. So how is shortage and surplus addressed, which is a key issue once you have reservoirs in the system? In the basin in 2007, there's a set of guidelines that were negotiated that were valid through 2026, which specified water releases and allocations from Lake Powell and Lake Mead and identified how shortages and surpluses are distributed. Primarily in the lower basin with Lake Mead, those are based on different elevations, and lower basin states receive reductions, primarily Arizona and Nevada. California doesn't, and that's an issue connected back to that Supreme Court case, which allowed it to move through and eventually have the canal built in Arizona, was to protect California's quote unquote senior priority. A minute addendum to the US-Mexico Treaty, minute 319, now also allowed Mexico to share in these surpluses and shortages. And so essentially, based on different elevations, so this is Lake Powell, this is Lake Mead, different releases downstream are based, and then based on different elevations of Lake Mead, different deliveries to these lower basin states are achieved. Something similar could potentially be considered for the Nile. And then the last piece is planning for climate change. And this is in a way beyond the law of the river. This is where we are now. And that's looking at drought impacts on our water supply and what can we do about it. And so this is where we see more of the innovation, technical aspects of protecting and adding reliability to the water supply. So I'm just going to talk about a few examples that have happened in recent years. One is this idea of using weather modification, which is cloud seeding, to enhance winter precipitation occurring over the basin. So in the upper basin, targeting clouds, storm clouds during the winter to increase snowpack and therefore increase the runoff that occurs in the spring snowmelt. The drought contingency plan, which Dr. Asefa had a picture of the negotiations, was an agreement that took about a couple of years between the basin states to take proactive reductions beyond those described in the interim guidelines that operate the reservoirs, so that more water remains in these reservoirs, primarily Lake Mead, to reduce the impact of shortage. Now, granted, that means some of these states would absorb more reduction, but it prevents the system from collapsing because some of the simulations we've looked at shows that if these reservoirs continue to decline to lower levels, it is almost very difficult, in some cases impossible, for them to recover to these higher levels again. And beyond the basin states, Mexico is expected to participate. And then the last piece is this new effort of experts coming together to try to resolve issues in the basin through technical work groups, which is the Colorado River Climate and Hydrology Work Group, which has representatives from all these different agencies and water users that come together to financially support emerging research and science that help us to understand basin hydrology and physical conditions, improve forecasts, so that we're able to put actions into play as soon as we can to address dire or extreme hot and dry conditions that impact the water supply. So in conclusions, just some of my takeaway messages here that hopefully we can think about in terms of the Nile is litigation is a costly and expensive and long process to resolve. So it's usually not the preferred option. That was the case with the original allocations and apportionments in the river, Colorado River. And complex issues require adaptive management as new challenges emerge. And that's what we saw with that water quality issue with Mexico. We solved one issue, but we essentially created another one with that environmental value in the wetland. And proactive measures to creating and maintaining reliable water supply, usually better than reactive solutions. And that's what we're seeing in our current phase now, getting ahead of it with water augmentation strategies, creating a work group, implementing the drought contingency plan. So trying to get ahead of these stressful conditions in the water basin. And then finally, collaboration is a more effective and efficient approach to address water management issues. During the beginning of this 100-year law of the river period, there was a lot of litigation, lawsuits, a lot of saber rattling. And now we're in a phase where we're recognizing that that's not going to work. We need to do things together proactively. I use the example of California. There was a lot of issues early on with the Arizona versus California lawsuit, a lot of tensions there. But now, through the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan, California, which doesn't have to, is now taking reductions, proactive reductions, because everyone is recognizing that at some point, if the system continues to experience extreme drought, even those with senior allocations and priorities become affected. They're just delaying the inevitable. So we all do need to work together to find efficient and proactive solutions. And with that, I will stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you for drawing the parallel between the U.S.-Mexico treaties and the Nile Treaty that is ongoing right now. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions when it comes to how the U.S. is sharing water during drought season and how the treaties look like. Our last but not least guest is Dr. Salzberg. We're really great to have you here. When I looked at his bio, I was trying to condense it, but I have to present it as is because he's a very well-rounded and it's really worth mentioning some of his involvement in this area. Dr. Salzberg is the director of the Water Institute at UNC. From 2010 to 2017, Aaron served as the special coordinator for water resources in the U.S. Department of State, where he managed the development and implementation of U.S. foreign policy on drinking water and sanitation, water resource management, and transboundary water issues. In this role, Aaron was the lead representative of the lead water advisor for the United States at several major international events on water, including the G8, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, and the World Water Forums. I believe that was the first position for the State Department that you held. Aaron has a PhD in genetic toxicology and a Master of Science degree in technology and policy from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and Master of Science degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Maryland. He currently holds an appointment as a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and serves as a member of the World Meteorological Organization's Scientific Research and Board. So welcome, Dr. Salzberg. We have lots of questions that came through here that you may be able to tackle at the end. With that, I'll pass the mic to Dr. Salzberg. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Samson. And maybe for that reason, I'll try to be as short as I can. But of course, before I begin, just to take a note, our heart goes out to the Ethiopian people during these difficult times. And obviously, we're all hoping that this current state of affairs passes as quickly as possible and as peacefully as possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. The Nile has been close to my heart for 20 years. And I think this is a unique opportunity to have a conversation about how we might think about some new approaches to the GERD. And I want to say at the outset that while we're talking about a dam, we really are talking about people, and this is easy to forget. I think we need to keep focused on the fact that people are going to be impacted, whether from the government negotiators all the way down to the farmers in the field. These are real people whose lives will be improved or potentially harmed by this dam. And this is true for any dam. And so the real question, and Dr. Asefa and Dr. Mahmoud both got to this, the real questions are not really about the dam, but about the distribution of costs and benefits. Who will get better and who will get worse under what conditions? I also want to be clear, and I think both our speakers have pointed this out, this is a solvable problem if the countries wanted to solve it. But because this is a problem about the distribution of costs and benefits, while it's partly a technical problem, it's mostly a political problem. That distribution of costs and benefits is often a political decision. And that's where this becomes a real challenge. And so while I think it's often useful to talk about the potential solutions, I think we also have to look at some of the failures. Why aren't we getting what are the reasons why we haven't gotten to agreement? We should be asking ourselves why the Nile Basin Initiative failed to solve this, why the agreed upon technical process through the independent panel of experts failed to solve this, why the 2014 statement between President Sisi and Prime Minister Haile Mariam on the margins of the African Union Summit in Malabo failed to solve this, why did the Declaration of Principles fail to solve this, why did the Independent Technical Advisory Group fail to solve this, why did the US Sudanese AU processes that have been going on over the past year fail to solve this? Is it because we lack a solution? I mean, you just heard two expert speakers, right? There are plenty of solutions to this. This dam is not unique. We just heard about the Colorado. There are many dams like this. There are many challenges around issues like this. Look, building the dam itself, of course, is a challenge. It needs to be safe. It should be able to efficiently provide multiple services, power, storage, flood protection, community development. It should be built and operated to minimize the impacts on the environment and local communities. And it should be operated to effectively and efficiently provide these services as best as possible for the largest range of stakeholders, both inside the country and outside. And like similar dams, this isn't always easy to do. Despite the fact that dams are big and they're monstrous, they're really finely tuned instruments, and they're designed to operate over a fixed set of conditions. And this is a region where things are changing rapidly. The demands of the countries for water and energy are changing constantly. And this means that the value of water is changing constantly. And this is where we have to be very, very careful about agreements that appropriate water. Because if the value of water is changing constantly, then the value of those appropriations is also changing constantly. And that's something that needs to be brought into the conversation and embedded within a mechanism for managing water in the right way. At the same time, the hydrology in this basin, of course, in the Blue Nile, is highly variable, both year to year, but it also, I think, will be significantly impacted by climate change. There are other challenges, and again, these are common in nearly every transboundary situation. They're not unique to the GERD. In this particular case, there are very legitimate competing interests between the countries. Each of these countries have raised grievances that are true and have merit. There's a broad understanding of current water uses and needs within the basin and the impacts, a broad misunderstanding of the current uses of water and needs within the basin and the impacts that might have on the dam. Much of the discourse around the GERD is driven by myths, not facts. We need to break through that, of course, and provide sound evidence for decision makers. These myths can distort issues and make it incredibly difficult to create the environment for there to be an agreement. There's a lack of institutional relationships or a longstanding history between these countries of resolving differences on critical issues. Dr. Mahmoud pointed to the Supreme Court as a mechanism that was used to be able to resolve some of those challenges. These mechanisms don't exist between these countries right now, and that's a critical challenge in trying to come to a solution here. And finally, there are very long-standing animosities that exist between these countries that have not yet been addressed. Whether justified or not, these animosities run deep and perhaps represent the greatest barrier to getting to a deal. So that said, the elements of a deal are not all that complicated. I think Dr. Asefa laid this out. We need to talk about the initial filling, the transition period between the initial filling and normal operations, and how you fill the rest of the dam, how the dam will be operated under normal conditions to maximize the outputs and minimize the impacts, and perhaps more importantly, how the dam will be managed under extreme conditions like floods and droughts. In other words, what will be the distribution of costs and benefits among all the stakeholders when those extreme events occur? One area the countries have not looked at seriously is the use of insurance schemes to protect their cash flows, right? And if we're talking about managing risk to Ethiopia that they won't be able to produce power, risk to Egypt that they won't be able to grow crops, there are other alternatives to protecting against some of those risks that we should be looking at. Now, in the case where you have multiple pieces of infrastructure, and Dr. Mahmoud pointed out a classic example of this, where you've got a system where operations may depend upon each other, then it's ideal to have an institutional arrangement, an actual organization or commission that ensures that each country can operate its own infrastructure to maximize its own benefits, but at the same time, that the group can collectively optimize its management across the basin to maximize their collective benefits and minimize their collective costs. And of course, this was the goal of the Nile Basin Initiative. I think Dr. Mahmoud made this point very well. It's critically important to have that organizational structure, to have a platform for joint data collection, data sharing, data analysis, for ensuring that the facts, not the myths, drive the discourse. These institutions are also important platforms for modeling and making collective decision-making around operations, right? In the US relationship with Canada, every year we sit down and we come up with a new operational model for how we're going to manage the Columbia. And we do that based on the data and the needs of the countries. This is what has to happen here. Perhaps most important, these platforms are critical for ensuring that good science finds their way into these decision-making processes. Now, the reasons why you do this is that there really is no table of numbers that will give you all the answers to every situation you're going to face. This is a highly dynamic system that will need to be a continual assessment, analysis, reevaluation of operations to meet the changing conditions and needs of the countries. So more than anything else, and I'll tell you, Dr. Mahmoud didn't talk about this, but the example of the International Boundary and Waters Commission that the United States has with Mexico, that commission and the treaty is well over 100 years old, but we've made almost 320 odd changes to the operations of that treaty. It has been incredibly adaptive, and that's what you need. You need an adaptive process that will allow the countries to respond to these changing challenges. And when this fails, you need to have a dispute resolution mechanism that allows differences to be resolved in a fair and agreeable manner. Critically important to any institution. And this is really what the outcome of the current process on the GERD must be, not just a set of rules and numbers, but an agreement to work together in a fair and transparent manner to ensure that all can benefit and that together they can resolve whatever problems may come. It's about a process. It's about institutionalizing a process between these countries on how they will work together to solve an incredibly complicated problem that is not going to go away. This problem is going to be here next year, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, 500 years from now. And how these countries work together to solve this problem is critically important. And that's what this discussion is really about. So while there is a technical discussion, it's really a political discussion about how these countries want to work together. Now, my own hope is that these countries will look beyond the water and realize that there are broader benefits that working together will mean for each one of these countries. For Egypt, it will mean greater water security. For Sudan, It will mean the potential to ramp up agricultural production and feed the entire Horn of Africa, right? And we need food security in the Horn. For Ethiopia, they'll be a leader in power production, but more importantly, a driving and leading force for peace, security, and economic development in the region. And that's the Ethiopia, of course, that we've all been hoping and waiting for. The countries need to start looking beyond the dam to the tremendous potential of what can follow. If they do this right, I believe it will be transformational. If they do it wrong, I think it will take a generation to fix. And given that this is the case, I think we have to ask ourselves, not just what the key elements of the deal should be, but why isn't it we don't have a deal yet? So maybe I'll stop there, Samson. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg, and thank you for acknowledging the situation that is going on in Ethiopia right now. On behalf of weASPiRE, we also think about all the victims that are affected by this internal conflict, and we wish resolution to come sooner. I would like to, before we get to the questions, I wanted to give Dr. Tirusew to summarize and kind of recap what we discussed up to this point. Just do it quickly so that we can get to, we're getting a lot of great questions.
Yes.
So I'll give you 2 minutes. You did that the last time, in 2 minutes to kind of do a round summary of what we just discussed.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank again to our excellent panelists, and I think we learned a lot. One thing to jump, I will start from the last presentation, to me is it is a cost-benefit analysis as well. And then also that we need to look beyond GERD. GERD is just one dam within Ethiopia, and for Nile Basin, I think we need to look beyond that. And some of the climate projection actually shows that you probably need more dam to tackle the climate change. So that's a key. And then I'm also happy that he mentioned that we didn't cover it a lot, but we wrote about that is a Colombia versus Canada versus United States in Columbia River. So the key thing here is to us as this group work on that is you have to have a guideline that herbs that could be changed, that could be updated, frequent. Every year they talk about it, they sit down and they plan. It goes back to Dr. Mahmoud's point as well, that there's a lot of change for the original treaty as well. So if we wanted to make to work at all, that we have to be flexible in terms of how we manage and how we take these things seriously. Again, the drought sharing is important. So I think I would want to highlight that both flood and drought should be shared in a way that could be a cost-benefit analysis as well. The insurance idea is that Dr. Salzberg brought is excellent. I know many researchers, they work on that in Latin America, especially in Brazil, Colombia. The insurance is part of your business operation. You deal with extreme conditions. So I think that should be looked at as well. I think with that, I will stop. And since we have a lot of questions, I think we will address some of those through the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tirusew. And as we do all the time, we ask the questions in the order that we receive them. I will skip the comments. We'll take them under advisement, but the questions, I will start from the top. The first question, what should Ethiopian Americans and Friends of Ethiopia do to get the support of the incoming Biden-Harris administration to help resolve the GERD issues? Okay, weASPiRE is a non-partisan, non-political think tank. Regardless of who's in the office, we continue to present facts. And those of you who wants to get involved and contribute, there is an Ethiopian Water Council that works on this issue. weASPiRE, be active. So we will continue to publish facts. Check out our website, weaspire.info. The next question, I'm going to give it to Dr. Tirusew. How well is Sudan protected from flood when GERD is fully operational? Just make it brief.
Yeah, I think it would be, I would say 100% protected. But again, we don't say 100% for a reason. I would say 99.99 because then you don't know what could come in the future. But at least looking at a flood, of once in 100 years and potentially once in 500, there is enough space to protect the GERD in a typical operation because it allocates 25 billion cubic meter for the summer. I must say GERD is designed for maximizing hydropower. So you maximize hydropower by filling it up. You pass the same quantity at lower level and higher level. It's different. So by definition, GERD with maximize means it will try to hold as much summer flood as possible. So that goes hand in hand with the flood protection again. And then there is also, I should mention, there is a great example between in the Columbia River, they call it Operation VAR. So when there are things that they may want to visit in terms of release that may have implication on the flood protection, because you are going to depend on forecast. In that case, there may be some cost benefit analysis they could do as well, and then also collaboration. But as it is designed for the summer, the way it's going to operate, it provides enough space to accommodate potentially up to once in 500 year flood.
Sorry, I'm going to disagree with that. I think that it's true that the dam could do that, but it really does depend on its operations. And if they do keep the operating range, as Dr. Asefa had mentioned, and so that once you enter into the summer, you still have close to 50 billion cubic meters of water in the dam, you're going to get 50 billion cubic meters of water on a high, in 1 in 500, you'll get more than that coming down during those summer months, which will overtop the dam. And so the management of the dam is absolutely critical if you're going to provide that flood protection, and that's going to require good hydrologic knowledge and information and forecasting, because you're going to want to drop those reservoir levels down significantly if you're expecting to get 60 billion cubic meters of water coming down that system in the summer. And if you don't do that, you will still end up with that flooding. And so there is a large operational element here. It's not just that the dam by itself will protect Sudan from the floods. How the dam is operated and how the forecasting is done and the coordination and discussions between the countries will play a key role in that.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg. Since this is a point of contention and on all parties in this GERD negotiation, Dr. Mohammed, do you have anything to add on this? I love it when we have opposing viewpoints in the same panel discussion.
I think Dr. Asefa would agree with me. So
it's good. It's good. It's good. I like it.
You know, Dr. Aaron Salzberg kind of beat me to the punch. I was going to mention it really depends on the operating regime, because what your starting reservoir condition during that flood period is going to dictate how much protection you'll provide. Not to say that you can't provide flood protection, but it's to what degree, and therefore how you're able. Obviously, the less room you're able to store, that minimizes your flexibility in trying to spread that pain out. But you also are trying to balance your other sort of priority, which is generating power, right? So that's depending on a different set of conditions that aren't necessarily purely hydrologic.
I should just
keep in mind then, so that the position you're putting Ethiopia in is they may unilaterally be trying to decide whether they keep the reservoir high to get more economic value out of the reservoir, or drop it to provide additional protection to downstream for what may be a potential flood. Really hard decisions to make.
That's correct. Just one thing to say, I think we agree. In our paper, actually, what we said is that you would need to have the storage at 55% full at the beginning of the summer to accommodate up to 150% of 1988 flood. Again, 55 is less than 2/3. So that's not even the normal operation that Ethiopia has, for example, is from 2/3 to full, which is 66%. Again, I think I want to stress that it is dependent on productions, and then what is the guarantee? Again, back to your point, Dr. Salzer, that this comes to the insurance part as well. If you project something, it doesn't happen or not, that's another issue too as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question, I'm going to give it to Dr. Salzberg. Since you talked about in your presentation about the animosity, it's sort of related into that. It says, interesting presentation. Don't you think in the case of the GERD, the main issue is lack of trust? Trust that was not there historically and currently too.
Yes, and maybe even more. You know, there's been a global conversation going on lately around systemic inequalities. And one might argue that Ethiopia feels, whether it's true or not, but feels that for years, the other countries in the basin have been systematically working to prevent Ethiopia from achieving its development potential. If those perceptions exist, then it's more than just a lack of trust. There's an actual feeling that there's an injustice that's been perpetrated for many, many, many generations that may also need to be addressed. And that's a different kind of a conversation and a really challenging conversation to have. I agree that there needs to be greater trust between the countries, but in any relationship, that trust might not be able to happen until you can begin to clear away some of those things that contributed to that lack of trust at the very beginning. And so I suspect that there needs to be a thoughtful conversation that happens between particularly Egypt and Ethiopia about their history, about their past, about the colonial legacies, about the role of these countries in those colonial histories, and a reconciliation about how they're going to move forward now in a more peaceful and cooperative way. And I don't think that process has happened yet. And I think absent that process, it may be very difficult to kind of reset those relationships in the region. And I think we're trying to force an agreement right now in a place where it might be difficult to reach an agreement because I'm not clear to me that the parties are ready for that yet.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Sorry,
Salzberg.
It fits much more with your other work, Samson.
Thank you, Dr. So the next question, I'm just going to put it on the floor. You can take it between Dr. Tirusew or Dr. Mohammed. Can someone comment on the debris deposit resulting from erosion and dead storage that the GERD design team assumes 50 years of capacity?
I will take it because I actually wrote an article on the issue of siltation. I think we are not panicking, and in fact, as a hydrologist, we are raising the flag in terms of the significant siltation that's coming to GERD as well. And in fact, its Amharic name is Black Nile. It's black because it's really full of silt. So the way the design currently is that it allocates about 10% of its capacity for the next 50 years. Basically, every 50 years, if the current siltation continue, you are going to lose 10% of the storage. So the 4.9 billion cubic meter actually last year Ethiopia put in that's basically for a dead storage in 50 years. Again, the calculation of siltation to the dam is not an exact science. There is so many things you have to calculate: the initial condition of the watershed, the intensity of rainfall, all kinds of things. So this is just a best guess estimate that they have. It could be more, it could be less. So I think it's better to assume it should be more and then works through some watershed level protections. I think the Ethiopian government started what they call the green legacy. There are some studies not only for erosion protection, but local climate impact. We have here some studies that shows, I think through that, we should be able to manage it. But remember, siltation is not just only for GERD. This is the international, for almost every dam, but it's a little bit pronounced in the GERD side, and they should address that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just gonna, yeah, exactly. I was gonna carry on that last point you made, Tirusew, which is, sediment deposit in dams is not a unique thing. I mean, if everyone thought that was a complete impediment to building a dam, we wouldn't have a dam. We wouldn't have any dams,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's a natural occurrence just because of how erosion and water flows. But I will say that there are plenty of dams in the world that have been around for a while that now look towards several years into many years into the future where this can become an issue of how to address it. There's an effort undergoing right now in Arizona for the Salt and Verde River watersheds in northern part of the state that services the greater metro area. They've been recording, keeping track of sedimentation deposit. They do bathymetry and measurement of information to get an estimate of how much is there and how much it impacts capacity. And now, part of the plan, it doesn't have to be up front, is to figure out, okay, later on, what should we do? Is dredging an issue, a potential solution? But it's not a unique problem, and that shouldn't be a reason to completely negate the idea.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Since you have the mic, I'm going to hold you there and ask you a question. In the presentation, there's an example of drought sharing U.S. states as well as Mexico. That could be a model for Nile Basin countries. Could you talk about that briefly?
Sure. Much like almost, I wouldn't say all negotiations, but quite a few, it wasn't painless. And going back to a point that Dr. Aaron made earlier, personalities play a big role in negotiations. So I heard someone talk about trust earlier. I saw it in one of the questions. The idea for folks, there were some obstacles to this. I mean, everyone understood, based on all the hydrologic simulations and computer modeling, that if we don't do nothing, the system was potentially heading to collapse. And once one of the stipulations in the guidelines is if the reservoir conditions in lake get so low, there's a point where the Secretary of Interior can step in as sort of the official water master to then decide to potentially make decisions on how the limited water that's available will be allocated, in a sense. One of the concepts is that if it gets so low, maybe you prioritize water to cities versus agricultural districts. The point is, all the parties, all the water users recognize that we don't know what the secretary would do, he or she, at that future point in time. And so the onus was for the basin state water users to have a little bit more control on their destiny, to try to protect the reservoir from falling to that level. And so that was one of the sort of triggers to move forward on creating this drought contingency plan. But there were other issues. California never, under the interim guidelines, never having to experience a reduction to their water supply. How do you get them to be convinced beyond this fact that, at some dire level, we're all impacted severely? How do you get them to come to the table and take proactive reductions that they've never had to under the guidelines agreement? And going back to the trust and personality issue, it sounds silly, but there were issues on who gets to sign the agreement for this, for each representative state, and it seems silly in retrospect, but without going into too much detail, so I don't get myself in trouble, there were issues in Arizona. So originally, as states had to try to kind of get their ducks in a row to come together and then bring all the different states together, there were issues in Arizona on who would take the lead, and it caused almost severe collapse of negotiations internally. And it took very serious, folks having to just kind of have reflection and bury some hatchets to move forward. So
maybe I can point to one mechanism, though, that directly answers that question that I think is very relevant for what's going on in the Nile. And this had to do with Minute 324. There's a couple different names along the way, but the idea that if, let's say, Las Vegas needs an extra 1 billion cubic meters of water, Las Vegas, the city, can invest in a water conservation project in Mexico. And if that project saves 2 billion cubic meters of water, Mexico would get 1 billion of that, but Las Vegas could get 1 billion of that. So it's an example where a country that might need extra water can invest in a water saving program in another country and share the benefits of that water saving program. In my view, if Egypt was investing in water saving projects in Ethiopia and Sudan, they should be able to get some benefit from those projects just like those other countries would get it too. It's a very innovative mechanism that leads to greater investment, water conservation, and greater shares of water for all the countries. A brilliant, brilliant mechanism between the US and Mexico.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg. While you're on the mic, there's a question you may be able to tackle. Do you think the development of UN Transboundary Water Conservation Bureau could be helpful to solve the disagreement if possible? I think it's referring to the current GERD negotiation.
No. And so first, this idea that there's this is a body of international water law that would dictate what happens on a transboundary basin is really not true. We do have a UN convention that it has been ratified, but to be frank, there's still there's a lot of disagreements around it. And even the implementation of that agreement is very difficult to do. There's a lot of things that need to be interpreted at a local level. And I think any UN entity would want to use that convention to try to solve a dispute. And it's been raised in this particular one. The two issues here are, how do you balance equitable use and significant harm? And let's just take one of them. How would you define what equitable is in this particular situation? Right? Because here you've got Ethiopia, which needs water to be able to do its development, but you've got Egypt, which has the lowest per capita water availability per person, I think, in the world, right? They got 1/2 of the water available per person than Ethiopia has. If you were to begin to divide up water on an equitable basis, what would you use to decide what is equitable? That becomes a real challenge, and I'm not sure that that can get resolved in this basin that way. The same is true with significant harm, because the question is, it's not just how much harm each country suffers, but how resilient they are to that harm. And it may be that Ethiopia is less resilient to harm right now than Egypt might be, but those tables can flip depending on what the conditions are and what's actually being harmed. These are not static things. And so, well, yes, the UN having better capacity to address transboundary water challenges, I think does help everybody, but I don't think it's going to work in this. Look, these are very good, smart countries. I'm always impressed with the Ethiopian, Sudanese, and Egyptian teams. They're very bright individuals who know what's going on very well. I think it's really in their hands, and I think they do have the capability to solve this.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg. Dr. Tirusew, I'm going to come to you. This question is directed to you, so it's a bit long and I'll read it. Without any doubt, cooperation is the way going forward in managing water in the Nile. The challenge comes when agreement like the 1959 comes in and try to implement it in the 3 countries. The water, as Dr. Asefa pointed out, is enough, but has to be stored upstream in the GERD to maximize its availability basin-wide. The question is, how can we bring these countries together? Great question.
Well, how it will be the leaders that has to bring the countries together. I think, as mentioned, that all the experts from all these countries knows what need to happen, what should happen in terms of water allocation. Again, we are looking at taking advantage of current situation. I can give you a simple example, that if Ethiopia were to feel now, started already feeling the first phase, given current condition, if you are asking me sitting here that is there significant impact, can they do it without making significant impact? And then we have to define, of course, but given the hydrology, given what's going on, I would say that this is a great time. In fact, if the dam was finished last year, we should have taken care of this flooding situation, and probably we wouldn't be talking about in terms of the filling phase. So to me, yes, there is enough water now, but we have to be smart in terms of understanding what's that change. People, they say that the agreement 50 years ago may have been simple. Today are simpler than you are going to make them 20 years from now. There is pressure in terms of growth for demand. So it's in the interest of the 3 countries to figure out, to have that agreement in place and cooperate. Yes, they can do now. And how do they do in terms of the availability? When we say it's available, that's enough. You have to look at all of your options. Some people raise, alternative water use, conservation, desalinated. All of the above has to be part of this, the big pie of water available in the Nile Basin to be able to, share and use it for the better of the countries.
But we should be clear, the 1959 agreement is not a barrier to an agreement on GERD. The 59 agreement is not binding on Ethiopia or any of the other upstream countries. It's a bilateral agreement between Egypt and Sudan, and there is no question that Egypt needs to maintain a bilateral agreement with Sudan on water. Egypt's water security depends primarily on Sudan, not on Ethiopia. And so there should be bilateral relations between Sudan and Egypt on water, between South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt on water, because that's going to be critical to ensuring their long-term water security. That is not an impediment to a deal on the GERD. There is nothing in the 1959 agreement that stops another deal from GERD going on. And in fact, there's nothing in the 1959 agreement that stops if you wanted to do an allocation of water, an allocation on water from the countries, that's different. There's nothing in that agreement that stops that.
While you're on the mic, Dr. Salzberg, why do you think Egypt and Sudan didn't sign the Comprehensive Framework Agreement, as is known as CFA?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of issues there, but the one was the issue we were just talking about, which was the status of prior agreements and whether or not the 1959 agreement could still remain in place with a comprehensive agreement at stake. And, you know, the United States has the same kinds of challenges. In fact, one of the reasons why the United States is not a party to the UN Convention is that we don't want to prejudice the existing agreements that we have with Mexico and Canada on transboundary water. And it was a similar situation that Egypt faced, but there was something else that happened. And that was the decision-making process within the NBI shifted in 2010. It went from what was a consensus-based process to a majority rules process. And so that makes it really, really difficult for any country to go into an organization and to agree to a treaty that a group of countries can decide what happens in your own sovereign country is almost impossible. No diplomat could go home and keep their head on their shoulders if they agreed to something like that. And so the conditions that were set up, I think, within the CFA became very, very difficult for a Sudanese or Egyptian diplomat to agree with, because they couldn't allow another group of countries to make decisions that would impact their own country's sovereign interests. And that was a real challenging dynamic. And unfortunately, you know, this idea that the countries can, you know, of course, the upstream countries have expressed a willingness to revise and amend the treaty to address some of those types of challenges, both on Article 14B, which is reservoir security, as well as decision-making protocols. But to do that, Ethiopia has argued that the countries need to ratify this agreement first, and then they will go and renegotiate the CFA. And again, that's a really tough position to put a diplomat in any country, to be able to sign up to an agreement that your country can't accept, in the hope that you will then be able to renegotiate it and get it to a place where you can accept it. That's just a very difficult diplomatic position to be in.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg. Dr. Mohammed, I'm going to come to you. After this question, Dr. Tirusew, you'll tell me how much more time we have for a Q&A. That's a lively discussion. I want to keep going, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time here and our attendance. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Mohammed, Ethiopia filled 4.9 BCM with much impact the downstream countries. It plans to store 13.5 BCM next year. Do you think this will create a significant impact on the downstream countries?
It could, depending on what your filling regime is going to be, right? I mean, if how you stretch out that strategy of filling the reservoir, coupled with what's the natural flow conditions in that point in time. If it's a flood season, you know, if it's another flood year, maybe not so bad, right? Because you could properly maybe ramp up your filling schedule while still not necessarily impacting downstream as bad. But if it's a drought year, people are going to be unhappy downstream. Yeah. That would be my technical answer.
Okay. And sort of related, Dr. Tirusew, I'm going to come to you. Two key disagreement between Egypt and Ethiopia is the drought time releases and binding agreement on GERD releases. Climate change is also often mentioned, potentially a changing future condition in both countries. How do you reconcile this?
I think first, in terms of the timing, probably we may have 10 minutes left, I guess, because it was 11:30, so 10 minutes. So yes, climate change is a big issue, but I think we have to, I can explain from my experience. I did look at the climate information for the entire Nile Basin, the data itself. So you have these hundreds of, as we call them, global circulation models. What do they say into the future? And there is an assumption again also what would be the future emissions of greenhouse gas to get. Let's pick, you know, some of the usually used scenarios, 4.5 or 8.5. So what you are going to see is that there is an increase rainfall, but significant variability, especially in the Blue Nile, but temperature is consistently higher. So that means then again, that may, depending on the water balance, depending on the hydrology, it may impact your flow as well. But overall, what we see from the Blue Nile perspective is you have these erratic flows. Basically, you have shift in seasons that basically says you probably need to store. So going ahead, to me, is that we know rainfall will be much more variable. Temperature would increase. And going back to my presentation, where do you want to store it? So you would like to store it in a place that's not hot. And then also that you want to build more dams in the upstream of GERD. In fact, I would argue that you need to build more dams. So you need to increase the storage capacity of the system as well. So that's how you reconcile it in terms of the climate change impact. Again, climate projection is not a prediction, it's a projection. That means it could happen. So you have to work through that. But coming back to the sticky point with the negotiating team is that it's hard if you want to fix a certain release without implying allocation and knowing that climate may change how it distributes water in the future. So you have to have some flexible way of agreeing on things as you see it in the ground, and you adjust. We gave many examples in here, so they should be doing that. But if you want to fix something later on, the countries will be in a place that they can't honor that, and you set up yourself for failure, basically. So to me, that's how I look at it. So it is there, climate change is there, the impact is there, but it's not something we can solve as a collective countries.
I see Dr. Salzberg shaking your hands. Do you have anything to add to what Dr. Tirusew said? Or in fact, the next question is coming to you.
No, I think the adaptive nature is exactly right, but I'm going to turn to Dr. Mahmoud because he was trying to add a point there, I think, too.
I was just going to mention, connected to this question, I think the last question you asked, Samson, is we didn't really talk about is, at least from perspective of downstream, what's going on with the White Nile, right? I mean, we're focusing on the Blue Nile, but also what's happening with the White Nile is, has that sort of propagating effect downstream as well. So we shouldn't necessarily just put the onus completely on what's happening with the White Nile, but just, what's happening there as well has an impact on the downstream users.
Thank you. So for the participants, we have lots of questions. What we can do is we will take your questions and then we will provide responses from the experts on our website. The next question, I want to give it to Dr. Salzberg, and I'll ask, unless Dr. Mohammed have anything to add, Dr. Tirusew to kind of wrap up and summarize the discussion. So the question is, Dr. Salzberg, in the past, Egypt has dictated the development in the Nile Basin. I believe you have said in the past that the GERD might reflect a more balanced approach, not just to how water is managed, but also to power dynamics within the region, if both Egypt and Ethiopia can develop cooperative relationships, unquote. What exactly needs to happen to make this a reality?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and it's the exact right question to ask. I mean, one of the reasons why I started working on the Nile issues was that, the World Bank had done a study, and they said that if these countries can work together cooperatively on development of the Nile, they could advance economic development 2 to 5% GDP. And that's enough to pull these countries out of poverty. And I believe that. I believe that that cooperative management of the Nile Basin can ensure that these countries can develop fully, peacefully, be more energy, food secure. Not only that, but I think they can help provide for large, I mean, Sudan could feed all of Africa, right? If its agricultural potential was developed. There is no question that you want to produce power and store water in Ethiopia, you want to grow food in Sudan, and you want to ensure you can meet human needs and basic needs in Egypt. You can reconcile all these different interests. I think that though to do that, though, that's got to be the goal of the countries. And you don't using the dam as a tool to reset the power dynamics is probably not the right approach, right? Because how do you then develop a process where you can work with the other countries to optimize the costs and benefits across the basin, especially one that's this complicated as this? Not only do you have High Aswan Dam in Egypt, you've got other dams in Sudan as well that need to be operated conjunctively with the GERD. And so you need a political commitment between these countries that, we're going to sit down and we're going to work together on this. Now, I'm not saying that Ethiopia should give away its sovereign rights, right? Ethiopia has the right to develop its water for its own benefits. It needs to do that. But we also need to be sure that this dam does provide for the Ethiopian people. And that means making additional investments in Ethiopia that allow for power in the country, that allow for power export outside the country, that ensures that water can be utilized effectively and efficiently in the country, so that Ethiopia itself can be water secure and energy secure. That should be at the top of all our priority lists. And the question is Egypt and Sudan on board with that vision? And are they willing to work with Ethiopia to achieve that vision? And at the same time, is Ethiopia willing to do that in a way that can accommodate those other downstream interests and be a leader in the region? I think I've long thought that Ethiopia's work on the Nile could be its entry point into the global stage, the global leadership, right? I mean, this is a chance for Ethiopia really to show how it can influence the way a continent works in a positive way. And I hope they show that leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Salzberg. Unless Dr. Mohammed have anything to add, I want to give one question to Dr. Tirusew and I'll ask him to wrap up. Dr. Mohammed, do you have anything to add?
I think that's as a fine and salient point as I need to be left with. So thanks for that.
I just want to raise one important question to Dr. Tirusew. Integrated water resource management dictate all of the above solution, including alternative water source, groundwater utilization. How can the three countries take these into consideration for a win-win solution?
Great question. And then also, I think I will add on what was said by Dr. Salzberg on cooperation, and then the next step as well. That before I answer that, I think that answer itself actually along what I was going to say. Currently, these three countries are in negotiation and they are going through all kinds of process. But I think it's my personal opinion that even if they agree on something, then what? Do we have even the manpower, the capacity, the infrastructure, all those people who do all these things? Well, we mentioned in US, for example, we don't have those institutions. So I think the water resource management, integrated water resource management you just mentioned, it's beyond one country. You should be able to produce, different centers and bring the manpower to a position that you'll be able to manage this. We talked about a lot about operational synchronization and operational cooperation. It won't be there if we don't have the capacity to do it. So I think lost in translation is that in the Nile Basin, I know NBI, the Nile Basin Initiative is a good place and they have been doing that, but they are limited as well. So it has to be expanded and be ready to take this challenge once there is an agreement. I don't think we know exactly, we agree tomorrow and what's going to happen next year. back to your question, integrated water resource management, one of the things we say here is that you have this complex interaction between groundwater, surface water, and other resources you have there. You should take it to your advantage. So what we do here is that at the times when you have a lot of surface water, you use that. And if you don't, go to the groundwater because the groundwater is underground storage pretty much without even too much loss from the evaporation. So you should look at all those, all of the above solution. There is a lot of, conservation. I think in the past people mentioned Egypt access to desalination, it is true, but we have to remember it is limited. And then also it could be costly. Things are getting cheaper as you move forward, but limited. So you have to diversify. So we run a desalinated seawater facility here. The cost is not what used to be 15 years ago. I guarantee you that. And then if you produce, the majority of the cost is energy. Now you have this energy production in Ethiopia that you can actually use to even supply. So to me that, and all of the above approach, including looking at this management of different sources through the integrated water management, that's the way to go. Again, it goes back, I think people know this, we just need the leadership and the infrastructure to execute what needs to happen.
Thank you very much. I have a tendency to kind of set the stage for the next webinar at the end of one webinar. So I would like to, my wish is to have participants from Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and have Dr. Salzberg kind of facilitate a discussion. We would like to see opposing viewpoints reflected. What are the contentions? What are the way forward? And this is beyond governments, beyond politics, strictly on technical matters. So we'll work with you offline, Dr. Salzberg. I want to thank all participants for being available today on Saturday to spend time with us. weASPiRE, visit our website, weaspire.info. And I received a lot of questions in the chat. How can we, take part in working with the new administration about the Nile? As I said earlier, weASPiRE work with any administration, regardless of who's in power or who's in the office for the term. We are non-partisan, non-political, and there is an Ethiopian Water Council as well, the group of experts. Be active, be engaged, be positive, and use measured words in these discussions. Thank you very much. On behalf of weASPiRE, thank you.